Hello everybody, this is an ongoing series examining the dungeon design in Zelda games. If you're interested, feel free to check out the previous videos in this series, but otherwise, let's hop into it. Last time, we awakened Medley as a sage and conquered the Earth Temple, which powered up the Master Sword. Now it's time to do the same for the Wind Temple. But just like last time, there's an item that we need to obtain before we can do that. This time, it's the Iron Boots, which we can get by heading over to Ice Ring Isle and using a fire arrow to calm the blizzard. Heading into the island's interior, we'll find the Iron Boots in this treasure chest. Lovely. Now, if you've played Ocarina of Time, then these should be familiar, but I do appreciate that Wind Waker shakes up the use for these. We won't be doing any underwater exploration at all. Instead, we'll be using the Iron Boots to withstand heavy winds, which is demonstrated to us right away as we need to use them right here in this cave. Just a side note, but if you haven't yet already, I do recommend getting the upgraded magic meter before this dungeon, which can be obtained by defeating a big octo near the southern edge of the map to rescue this great fairy. It's not mandatory, but it will be a big help during this dungeon as we'll be using the leaf to glide a lot in here. With that, we can now head over to Gale Isle and use the Iron Boots to withstand the winds here. There's an octo statue that can be smashed, and that will cause the winds to subside, revealing a cave entrance. Just like before, we'll find a stone tablet with a new song, the Wind God's Aria. This summons the spirit of the former Wind Sage. Just like Laruto, he was killed by Ganondorf, so in order to power up the Master Sword, we will have to track down his descendant, who would have inherited his musical instrument. As was the case with Medley, this would be a character that we've seen before. It's Makar, the cutest Korok in existence. We'll find him in a cave behind this waterfall, practicing his music. We can play him this song and he'll be awakened to the knowledge of his destiny as the Wind Sage. Now he'll join us on the boat and we can ride back to Gale Isle, play the Wind God's Aria, and the stone tablet will crumble to reveal the entrance to the Wind Temple. Coming hot off the heels of the Earth Temple, which had a dark atmosphere and brilliant puzzles, I had high hopes for the Wind Temple. Once more, we have a companion during the dungeon, and the dungeon structure overall returns to the central room-based progression style that I'm so fond of, in which the dungeon is more like one larger puzzle that you unravel like a tangled headphone cord, rather than a series of smaller puzzles strung together through separate rooms. Thinking back to my memories of these dungeons, I always recalled the Earth Temple's dark atmosphere, when really its greatest strength is its winding level design, its gradual building up of its mechanics, and wonderful puzzles. My childhood memories of the Wind Temple are of getting absolutely lost in this huge, and I mean huge, central room and struggling with navigation. So if you've watched this series since the start, you'll know that I love dungeons that test my brains. Dungeons like the Forest Temple are perfect examples of this, and heck, I even loved Ocarina of Time's Water Temple and Majora's Mask Great Bay Temple for these reasons. And if you look at how the map all branches from this huge vertical central room, conceptually everything should fall into place to make this one of this series' best dungeons. Everything on paper suggests to me that this should be my favorite dungeon in the Wind Waker, and yet in execution, it's not. Maybe I overhyped it in my head, but playing through the Wind Temple has left me with an impression that this dungeon is incomplete. There's just no big oomph moment, no huge payoff like that final mirror puzzle. There's just something missing. I think I figured out why that is, but first, let's look at the architecture. The overall look and feel of this dungeon feels to me somewhat uninspired. I love some of the murals and motifs seen throughout it, but most of the dungeon's design and even its color palette just feel bland and underwhelming to me. The entire dungeon is beige and brown, and though there are some hints of green overgrowth here and there, it's just not enough for me to find it particularly visually distinct, especially when the Forbidden Woods did that better. And it's not like in the case of the Earth Temple, where its dark and lifeless aesthetic could be used to contrast with some of these more colorful moments to give some really visually striking and memorable payoffs. No, it's just going to be beige and brown in every room. More beige, more brown, beige, and brown. The actual dungeon layout doesn't really fare much better. This is structurally similar to places like Snowhead, Great Bay Temple, and the Water Temple, in which most of the dungeon branches off from a huge vertical central room. But navigation isn't nearly as much of a challenge here because there's just not that many paths. It's all spectacle and no substance. Even comparing the maps of the Wind and Earth Temple, despite the Earth Temple's linear, funneling 3-act structure, its map appears far more complex. In the case of the Wind Temple, which should have navigation being its challenge, it's far easier to find your way around. I have such distinct memories of this place stumping me, but I also know that as a kid I had a terrible habit of just never checking my map ever. So that said, the temple gives you both the map and compass very early on, meaning that you can always see exactly where you need to go with no problem. Don't have that key you need? Oh, just look, there's a treasure chest in that room, and yep, there's the key you needed. And while this huge central room looks daunting, the truth is that the dungeon sections off the central room. The first time you enter the room, only a single floor is accessible, leaving you with one path to explore. Then later, the floor opens up to reveal more of the rooms below, where you can find 2 more paths, but only one is accessible. Then it traps you in there until you have the dungeon item, and then later, it turns the fan on so you can fly up to the 2nd floor. Then the floor opens up again at the bottom to reveal another path over to the boss room. So rather than you being presented with a big tangled knot and having to figure out where to start and how to unravel this dungeon, the Wind Temple simply does that for you, removing most of the exploration and effectively negating that sprawling central room style progression that I love so much. There's also the enemies of the dungeon, which too feel a bit uninspired. So far up until now, every dungeon has introduced to us new enemies that feel right at home and completely suited to the themes of the dungeon. The Wind Temple does not. Aside from the boss, all of the enemies in this dungeon are baddies that we've already faced or seen elsewhere, and with the exception of the P-hats, none of them play into the theme of Wind Temple whatsoever. It's too bad as well, because something Wind Waker has done really well until now is introducing us to challenging enemies early on in the dungeon, and then giving us a dungeon item that allows us to defeat those enemies more easily. But that's not the case here either. Then there is Makar. Just like with Medley, Makar is going to be joining you for the duration of the dungeon. And I love this little guy, he's so cute. But he simply feels far less integrated into the level design than Medley did. In this way, the tag team mechanic feels like a regression to me rather than a progression. Maybe this would be less noticeable if you were made to do this dungeon first, but because this is after the Earth Temple, it's made all the more clear. You could interact directly with Medley to fly together across gaps, have her fly on her own to get to out of reach places, and reflect beams of light to interact with the dungeon's many puzzles. Combined with Link's mirror shield, having Medley felt like an extension of your own abilities. So rather than feeling like a chore of an escort mission, she was a valuable asset that would enhance your experience. She was a genuine pleasure to have as an ally. Makar, on the other hand, is not. First off, his run speed is significantly slower than Medley's. She can keep up with Link and rarely fell behind. Makar can't, meaning that rather than having him simply follow you around, if you don't want to wait for him, you'll have to carry him. At least when that's a viable option, because many of the rooms in this dungeon are largely vertical, which means you can't always carry him room to room, and so you need to use the command melody to play as him and slowly trek across each room. And while he can fly, he doesn't do it nearly as well as Medley can, and he's too small to carry Link and fly across gaps that way. So rather than being an enhancement of your abilities, Makar is simply a chore. Rather than having an ally with unique abilities that complement your own, you're made to babysit. And I think the developers knew this, which is why early on in the dungeon, you are forcefully separated and he has to sit out of rooms like this one, because it would just be too much of a pain to carry him through here. Furthermore, Makar's special skill just isn't nearly as engaging as Medley's. With Medley, you could reflect these light rays. This was crucial to puzzles, but it was also interesting and fun to do. Makar's special power is planting trees, which rather than using precision to manually aim and interact with your surroundings and puzzles, is done by simply walking to the appropriate spot, waiting for the prompt, and pressing a button. It's just not nearly as satisfying to do, and while it is crucial to some of these puzzles, simply walking over to the spot and pressing A here, and then pressing A here, is just not nearly as fun as doing all of this. This isn't to say I hate Makar or that I hate this dungeon, I just have some genuine criticisms. I do love the way it uses the iron boots in new ways, some that Ocarina of Time only barely dabbled with, and others that are completely unique to this game, like using them to weigh down these springboards and then removing them to launch yourself into the air. That's brilliant. And another that we'll be touching on in a bit. The music fares okay here as well. It's not the strongest track in the game, but it has this constant fading in and out sound that works well to complement the idea of dizzying, spinning fans, if that makes any sense. It has that same sort of disorienting feeling that Great Bay Temple accomplished with its track. Then there's some acoustic guitar and these pleasant xylophone-like sounds that layer on top to disarm you with a pleasant feeling. Only to then undermine that pleasant feeling with these strings which bring a sense of tension and dread. Overall, while not an easy listening track, I think it's layered really well, and the contrast between those pleasant acoustics and these tense strings is musically really interesting. So I've complained enough, let's get into the dungeon progression. We'll start in this room with literally nothing to do. So head on through the door and we'll come to the foyer room. There's a couple of things to do here, but first things first, go ahead and defeat the Wizrobe and the Stalfos that will show up here. You'll find the first warp cauldron here, right by the dungeon entrance. Very nice. And there's these two spots on the ground where you can have Makar plant some trees. This is optional, as it simply reveals a chest with some cash, but it is a good way for the dungeon to introduce this mechanic to you. You'll notice these big wind turbines blowing air downwards, which is going to prevent us from crossing this room. So you'll want to use the command melody and take control of Makar so that you can walk underneath it and fly up to push this switch, which will disable the fans. Now with Link, you can use the iron boots on this springboard to launch yourself back up to the upper ledge, and then use it in conjunction with the leaf to launch yourself up and glide across the room over to the next door. This next hallway appears blocked off, but you can use a gust with your leaf to activate this rotor switch, which is similar to the ones we saw back in the Forbidden Woods, which will activate the mechanism that gets this wall to open up. There's some Arno statues to defeat here, but then we can take Makar across the room, avoiding the blade trap, and have him plant trees in these two spots, which unlocks the door somehow. We'll next come into this room where we'll hit a locked door, but there's some ledges out of reach here. We can take Makar for a flight, and we'll be able to plant 1, 2, 3 more trees here, which unlocks the door we were stuck at, as well as one up on this ledge here. So remember that door for later. But then Makar will be surrounded by floor masters and captured. We'll see him again soon though. Heading through the door we just unlocked, or the one that isn't out of reach that is, we'll find ourselves in the central room of the dungeon, and Makar is trapped in a little prison cell here. If we head over to talk to him, he'll mention that the entrance to his cell is blocked by this large stone statue, which we can't use the power bracelet to lift for some reason. So we'll have to find another way. The hint he gives us is that we have to become heavier in order to move it, and we do have the iron boots to increase our weight, but that's not enough. There's only one door available to us at this point, so we can defeat the two Armos Knights and head on through. We'll find another hallway with the wall that needs to rotate, so we can duck below, turn the rotor switch to do this, then use the iron boots with the springboard to launch ourselves back up and cross the room. We'll see a stone tablet here, where we'll need to play the Wind God's aria, but since we're separated from Makar at this point, we'll have to remember that for later, and instead head through the side door. This room is one of the dungeon's more memorable moments. The room has a bunch of fans blowing up, and we'll need to glide around the room from platform to platform using these updrafts, all while avoiding enemy attacks and finding safe places to land and snipe at them. It's pretty fun, and there's plenty of grass to cut for magic drops as well. Just try not to fall down to the bottom floor of the room, as you'll have to backtrack to the start of the room and try again. The room branches off, and at one end, we'll find a treasure chest with the map. Following the other path, we'll reach the next door. This next door actually loops us back to this upper ledge of the central room's first floor. We'll find the second warp cauldron here, which is very well placed, conveniently here in the central room. And there's this switch, which we can use the iron boots to press down, which opens the floor of the room to reveal the basement floor. We've done all that we can here on the first floor for now, so let's head down. Just make sure to stop on this ledge with the treasure chest to grab yourself the compass. But don't worry, if you miss it, we can grab it later on the way back up. Down here at the bottom of the central room, we'll find two doors. This one is locked, so we can head on through the other one. There's a sort of puzzle here in which we can break the floor to drop down below the room, defeat the enemies, and then push this springboard to the appropriate spot so that we can launch ourselves through this hole and back into the room above, but on the other side of the spike barrier. This isn't a hard puzzle though, as instead of relying on your spatial awareness, they've simply marked the spot on the floor where you have to launch up from. This treasure chest has a key, and the spikes will retract. There's also an optional chest in this room, which you can get by breaking all of the blocks in the floor here and defeating all of the enemies that spawn in when you do so. This will get you a treasure chart. Okay, now that we have that key, we can cross back through the central room and spend that key on the locked door that we saw before, which takes us to the mid-boss fight. There's a more powerful Wizrobe, who I will nickname King Toucan, who spawns in a second Wizrobe and a Darknut. The Darknut will attack you more head-on, while the Wizrobes will fire projectiles at you. Since the Darknut is slower, and the Wizrobes will keep trying to spawn in more enemies, I suggest avoiding him and using fire arrows to take out the Wizrobes first. Then finish off the Darknut using parry techniques. Defeating all of these enemies will reveal a chest and reward us with the dungeon item. It's the hookshot. Okay, so I've said this before, I love the hookshot in nearly every Zelda game, but this is actually my least favorite version of the legendary item. Like some of my other complaints with the dungeon, the use of the hookshot in the Wind Waker just feels uninspired. We already have the grappling hook, which is used to reach areas that we normally can't, as well as using it to swing across gaps and pickpocket enemies. Since the grappling hook already is more versatile, the hookshot feels like a strange late addition that is just here because it's a Zelda game and they felt like maybe they had to include it, I guess. It's just not as interesting a dungeon item as it usually is in other Zelda games, in my opinion. But, well. We can now use the hookshot to zip to those hookshot targets that we've been seeing all over the dungeon. But first things first, we're locked in this room, forcing us to use the item to get out, as usual. You can hookshot up to this ledge and use the hammer to press this switch down and voila, door unlocked. Now back in the central room, we can use the hookshot as well as a couple of springboards to ascend up platform to platform around the room until we're back up to the first floor. Now we'll see there's a hookshot target on the giant stone here where Makar is trapped. And if you try to use the hookshot on it, he'll reiterate that hint where you need to be heavier. So you can switch on the iron boots, which will keep you grounded, and instead of pulling you up, it'll pull the statue down, destroying it. Just don't get caught under it. So now you're reunited with Makar. There's a couple of things you can do for now. Down here at the bottom of the central room, you can use Makar to plant 2 trees, which actually activates the large fan under the floor of the central room, which creates a shortcut up through the central room, and we'll need it turned on for later. Next, our best bet is to revisit those spots that we couldn't access before without having Makar and the hookshot. If we head down this hallway again, back to where we found that stone tablet, we can play the Wind God's aria to break this stone, revealing another door. Heading through it takes us to a battle against a trio of Darknuts. They are pretty tough, but we've battled Darknuts a number of times already, so just remember to time your parries carefully, and you'll be able to remove their armor. Defeating all of them will reward us with, oh, it's the boss key already. Great. The other path we saw on the first floor, which we couldn't get to before, is back in that room near the entrance with the 3 trees that Makar had planted before getting kidnapped by the floor masters. Heading back in there, we can take out these Wizrobes and now use the hookshot on those trees to ascend up these ledges and head through the door, which takes us to a nearly identical room where you again can plant trees and use the hookshot to ascend up the ledges. This will have looped us around to the second floor of the central room where we can push down these these 2 switches, which will open up the floor at the bottom of the central room. But all there is down there is a locked door, which we don't have the key for yet. So instead, we can ride the updraft of wind to cross to the other door on the 2nd floor of the central room, which takes us into a short combat challenge against a handful of Armos, who we can stun with the bow and strike in the back to defeat. This battle rewards us with a key, which we can now spend on that final locked door on the bottom floor of the central room. Next, we'll be locked in this room for another combat challenge. We can defeat all of the enemies in this room for an optional chest with a treasure chart. There's a Wizrobe and a pair of Stalfos to defeat here, as well as a few Bokoblins that are hiding on the upper ledges of the room. Otherwise, we can hookshot up and find this heavy switch to press down, which unlocks the door. Okay, we're on to the last stretch. There's some Bokoblins and Armos Knights to defeat, but otherwise we can cross this room by having Makar plant a tree and hookshotting across. You can defeat the Floor Master and some Peahats and head through the next door, where we'll find one final puzzle. There are some large fans which will blow you back if you're not wearing the iron boots, and some blade traps in this room. You can push these 3 blocks to shield yourself from the blade traps and make a bridge across this small gap here, so that you can safely pick up Makar and carry him across the room. There's a final stone tablet here where we can play the Wind God's aria, as well as the final warp cauldron here. But otherwise, we'll find ourselves here at the boss door. The boss room is full of sand, and this being a Zelda game, well, you probably know what that means. More sand will flood into the room, raising the floor level, before the dungeon boss reveals itself. A giant worm creature bursts from below the sand, flies around the room, and burrows back below. This is Molgera. Giant sandworms are nothing new to the Zelda series, but Molgera does shake things up slightly. Visually speaking, he's pretty much what you'd expect, but I do like the way his mouth opens up in this strange sort of loose, flappy way, and the way that his tongue is this bright blue really makes it stand out as his weak point. In addition, these spurts of glowing neon green blood that flies everywhere when he takes damage is visually very distinct. It's a nice touch. As far as gameplay goes, what I don't get is how he's the boss of the Wind Temple. I don't really see how he fits in with the overall dungeon's theme, but oh wow. As far as gameplay goes, the fight plays out more similarly to the Volvagia battle from Ocarina of Time than any previous sandworm battles that we've seen before. You'll want to avoid Molgera as he flies through the air, and when he emerges from the ground, use the dungeon item on him. Though instead of smashing his face with the hammer, like with Volvagia, we'll be using the hookshot to grapple his tongue and pull it towards us so that we can dish some damage out with our sword. All the while, little larval Molgeras will spawn in and try to attack us as well, though you can yank them out of the sand with the hookshot and kill them with your sword easily enough. If I'm being honest, this fight is pretty easy. If I were to rate it against other dungeon bosses in this game in terms of difficulty, I'd slate it right between Goma and Kaldemos. He's so big and slow that avoiding his attacks is really easy to do. If he does get you, he'll gobble you up for a bit and then spit you out, but even then, the only time this happened during my playthrough was when I let him do it on purpose so that I could get footage of it. So here's the footage. I will say though, the way he pulls the sand into a pit like this and tries to swallow you is visually striking, if not a bit cliche, but I like it. After getting enough strikes in on his tongue, he'll die, exploding from tail to head. Then sand will drain out of the room, we'll get our heart container, and we can conduct Makar to play the Wind God's aria once more, with his prayers powering up the Master Sword, which now fully restores its power. Wonderful. So that's the dungeon. Overall, while the Wind Temple feels like a bit of an underwhelming experience, it does still have some sparks of good design. It uses the hookshot in conjunction with the iron boots in a way that we haven't seen before in the series, and it really does have some fun moments. Like this room, which feels like a big leaf gliding obstacle course. I love that. But it lacks some of that quality puzzle design that we've seen in earlier dungeons. This is the Wind Waker's penultimate dungeon, so in my eyes it should feel large, bombastic, and brutally difficult. Instead, while it does appear large in scope, in actuality it's just large and empty. And aside from some of its tougher combat moments, where it just gives you more of the same enemies we've seen before, but packed together in small rooms, rather than giving you new, interesting ones, the dungeon overall feels like a regression in challenge and scope from the dungeons dungeons before it. This issue may have been mitigated by simply switching the dungeon order. Since you don't technically need the hookshot or mirror shield for the opposing dungeons, and apparently you can't use the power bracelets in here for these big statues for some reason, then this would have instead played out with this dungeon introducing you to those tag team mechanics, then the Earth Temple expanding on it, instead of, well, what we got. The Wind Temple should have been a great dungeon, but in execution, it's not. The dungeon does all of the navigational work for you by unraveling this central room piece by piece, so all of the real challenge has to be artificially padded out with hordes of enemies. Enemies which we've seen already. It's a shame, to say the least. And while I don't hate the Wind Temple, I simply don't think it lives up to the precedent set by those that came before it. Thank you so much for watching this video. I just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you to those who supported me on Patreon. In particular, those who supported at the cheese tier or higher. And that includes Tetra, Brenda, Justin, Callie, Finley, and Grey Mage. Thank you all so much for the support, and I will catch you next time. Bye bye!